Hello and welcome to So Now What with Gates Cambridge, a podcast tackling some of the world's wicked problems with those who are dedicated to doing something about them. I'm Catherine Galloway, and my guests, as always, are Gates Cambridge scholars working to make an impact in the lives of others. But how do you make an impact when the current news cycle feels more like a spin cycle? 2026 is a mere 2 months old, and we've already seen major upheavals in the world order. Some leaders very publicly thinking on their feet, and others very publicly ceasing to be leaders overnight. Thanks to the ancient Greeks, we accepted ages ago that the only constant in life is change. But the sheer pace of this now feels new and, frankly, a bit mesmerising. Yet clearly we can't afford to be mesmerised. The wicked problems are still waiting and require, as ever, steady focus and diligent chipping away. So how do you lead for the longer term in a world of rapid change? Keep your head when all around you are losing theirs. Yes, we could start by silencing those blood pressure spiking breaking stories and just get on with our homework. But to make a profound difference for the greater good, there's much more to it than that. Joining me on Zoom from Brussels today, I'm delighted to welcome Halliki Voolma, member of the Gates Cambridge class of 2011. And sitting beside me at Bill Gates Senior House in Cambridge is Seetha, who's just finishing up her Gates-funded PhD as part of the class of 2022. We're about to hear in more detail how ferociously busy you both are, so an extra large thanks immediately for agreeing to do this today.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Now, Halliki, on your desk at the moment at the European Commission is the new EU Gender Equality Strategy, a hugely significant document due to be published in early March and guiding policy across all 27 member states for the next 5 years. You work in the cabinet of EU Commissioner for Equality, Hadja Labib, designing major legal and policy initiatives that shape lives right across the continent, including the 2025 Roadmap for Women's Rights and the first ever EU-level law on combating violence against women, including domestic violence and online abuse, something you had argued for in your Cambridge PhD thesis on multidisciplinary gender studies a whole decade earlier. You were born in Tallinn, Estonia, in the midst of the so-called Singing Revolution, a peaceful and successful protest against Soviet occupation, subsequently moving with your family to Budapest before arriving at Cambridge as an undergraduate. A citizen of the world, then, attuned to all the different identities we inhabit, a situation you share with Seetha, a filmmaker and podcaster who grew up in Australia in an Indian-Malaysian family before heading off to France for a degree in Middle Eastern studies, and then the Gates Cambridge Scholarship brought you here, Seetha, for a PhD in sociology. Your research aims to unpack all the different stories of who we are and how we tell those stories, notably in the context of post-colonial migration in the UK and including everything from family culinary histories to musical heritage. That work cannot just live on the page. Your documentary film, Black Town, Black Gown, co-directed with your colleague Kenny Monrose, premiered at the Cambridge Festival last year and saw you out there listening, recording in hairdressers, cafes, lecture halls and libraries, piecing together what community can be and drawing our attention to what we've missed along the way. Policymaking and filmmaking are actually not that far apart. Both require inordinate patience, focused research, careful selection of what to put in and what to leave out, and the art of persuading a lot of people to do a lot of things. So with this shared skill set in mind, let's begin with one thing that you're both bringing to the table today that will help us get started on our question. Halliki, let's start with you.
So I am speaking to you from the headquarters of the European Union, and I'm bringing today a strong focus and determination for delivering on the long-term vision and principles of the European Union on gender equality, despite short-term, let's just say, chaos. So indeed, as you mentioned, Catherine, I'm preparing to adopt in the next weeks the next 5-year policy framework of the EU on gender equality.
So that policy is on your desk. You've been thinking about it for a long time, but you're feeling overall calm as you sit there in the chaos?
I'm feeling focused.
That's amazing. And what about you, Seetha? What are you bringing to the table?
I've come to the interview after a day of teaching. And so I'm bringing a lot of the reflections from some of my students. And today in particular, we were talking about Edward Said's idea of the contrapuntal. And I supervise or I teach on a course which is Revolution, Empire, and Exile. And it's a mixture of sociology and political theory. And we were discussing today what the contrapuntal can offer the world, and what the contrapuntal is about sitting with contradiction. It's about thinking with contradiction. What does contradiction offer to sociology? So that's the space that I'm in.
Thank you, Seetha. I mean, that's a beautiful start, isn't it? Extreme focus and also a willingness to sit in that contradiction, which seems to be coming at us faster than we can possibly breathe at the moment. It's worth saying that we're recording this podcast slightly early. It is the February episode, and of course, who knows what will have happened by the time it actually goes out. But the week that we're sitting here talking is the same week that Davos is going on, of course, and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney gave an absolutely barnstorming and profoundly real speech earlier this week describing Canada's new strategy, which he described as building the coalitions that work, issue by issue, with partners who share enough common ground to act together. Enough, but not everything. And he called that approach variable geometry. And I just wondered how that landed with both of you.
It really resonates because I think that a key part of leading in this kind of short-term news cycle is to convince others to openly support shared long-term goals. In my case, equality goals. I have one example of that from the past year. You mentioned, Catherine, earlier that we adopted, as the European Commission, a political declaration on women's rights principles in 2025. And that was a European Commission document. But, in this geopolitical moment, we felt it was important that this would reach beyond the Commission. So I embarked on a 6-month process to convince all 27 member states, the European Parliament, other EU institutions, and over 50 stakeholders, including the Gates Foundation, to publicly endorse this declaration on women's rights, precisely because my commissioner and our team, we really felt it was important that in these times of backlash and polarization, we show that, no, there is unity around the will to make progress on women's rights and gender equality, even if exactly how to get there or exactly what that means might vary a bit between different stakeholders.
That's so interesting. So that is issue by issue with enough shared common ground to get you there, but you have to vary it depending on who you're in the room with at any one time. Seetha, Mark Carney called later for creating a dense web of connections across trade, investment and culture, which we don't normally see mentioned in the same breath as those other things. So I imagined you having a bit of a Mark Carney moment there too.
Yeah, it's so interesting. A lot of my work is focused on, identity and identity formation. And so I think I've always been drawn to how within an individual life, individuals make sense of contradiction throughout their identities. This is something that we do every day in our daily lives as we're negotiating who we are in the world. And it's interesting to be facing, with these problems of an intensely polarized world that doesn't seem to be able to cope with contradiction at all, or hold those opposing views together.
Halliki, you wanted to say something?
I find this idea of tolerance for contradiction actually a really important part of how to be a good leader. I think in any context, but certainly in a polarized context. And actually, behind me in my office here, I have a poster. Actually, it's a Winston Churchill quote that says, "To improve is to change. To be perfect is to change often." But a lot of people are rather uncomfortable with change, and I think as leaders in today's world, we need to get comfortable. And for change to happen, we need to be comfortable with contradiction as well.
Halliki, working now for the EU Commissioner for Equality, that's really your first political role. It places you much more into the rapid change environment than you've had in the past. It's a huge brief as well. Obviously, you're across so many different subjects. What has this new post taught you about leadership in particular, either watching your commissioner or yourself?
Yeah, well, I actually should mention that my commissioner is Commissioner for Equality. And by the way, that means, she's basically like a minister in a national government, except that's for 450 million people in the EU. But she is also Commissioner for Crisis Management and Preparedness. So it's a triple portfolio, and I focus on the equality part of it. But I think this combination of portfolios and, working together with my other cabinet colleagues has shown me both about the difference between short-term goals and such as crisis management. It's very easy to convince people that, okay, there is a landslide, there is a conflict, we must respond. How to do that is not easy. Whereas convincing people that, chipping away, as you said, Catherine, at inequality and discrimination, which by definition takes a long time, to prioritize that in a context of crisis and convince others that we need to do so is not always so easy. But in terms of what I have learned in this political role with, more responsibility than I've ever had before, is really about the importance of people and both, connections with colleagues, but also about, the human aspect of negotiation with member states, with stakeholders, etc. So, when I was talking about convincing all 27 member states and various stakeholders to endorse our roadmap for women's rights, which, by the way, is a strange thing to do. The European Commission doesn't normally ask others to endorse its documents, but we really felt it was necessary. There I really focused on highlighting common points of interest, and it also really required persistent follow-up. So I really committed my presence, my expertise to each of these organizations and member states in turn, and often, making progress simply by not giving up and by furthering my also personal relationships with all these different people.
Halliki, you're making me think of an interview that I read recently with somebody who'd spent years as an entrepreneur. And he said, after years in finance, I learned that a good story can accomplish more than a good spreadsheet. And I think that's what you're gesturing at, making those connections with people. It depends on storytelling. And Seetha, you know this, right? Filmmaking is a long, slow, patient thing, but you're also dealing with people and you're also dealing with endlessly shifting parameters, the odd crisis. So how do you balance it?
The film, I started that in the first year of my PhD, and it was only premiered in March last year. And so it was an incredibly long time of gathering stories, of sitting with those stories, of seeing how they fit together and making sure that the actual narrative that we told was reflective of those experiences that we'd collected. And there is the fact that research may not always be the most efficient, quick, responsive kind of toolkit that we have. But what it does offer, I think, is that ability to not just see and give space to stories, but to really understand stories from multiple angles. And I think, as an interviewer, it's been one of the biggest privileges to sit with people with no time pressure for hours, walking around, Hyde Park with them or around East Ham and just hearing, what their life is. And so, yeah, it's a bit of a balance, I think, in these contexts of short-term, long-term impact.
Seetha, words matter a lot. When there are so many words coming at you at such speed, as Halliki has been mentioning in terms of the policy documents absolutely flowing over her desk in every type of way, and words when people narrate, they don't narrate in a linear way. So how do you develop that focus, which you need absolutely in the short term in a crisis, but how do you hear which words are important?
I think this comes back to the privilege of the time that you have to do a PhD, and so much of the emphasis, I think, in qualitative research is, sitting and listening to the transcripts over and over and over again. And really, so it's a very slow form of thinking and listening. And I guess I recognize that is not necessarily always afforded in other contexts. And I think I always look for those points of tension in someone's stories, because I think those points of tension really are quite revealing, and listening to where people are trying to make sense of the world themselves. When people are thinking with you in an interview, it's just the most magical thing. When you are, I imagine you feel this as a journalist, when you ask the question and someone's really thinking with you, and then usually that's where a lot of things, the narrative kind of unfolds. But yeah, I think it's difficult when there's the sheer volume of information that you're being inundated with. And I think, I don't know, I really struggle with this. I struggle with thinking about the dual tensions of nuance and time pressure, because we need to get stuff done, because actually the world needs a response, because things need to change. And I think weirdly the film, because it's an hour, it has certain time constraints. There was so much that couldn't go into that film, and actually we had to listen to certain parts more than others, and I think sometimes those decisions need to be made in order to communicate a message, and depending on who the audience is. So I think that there is always this balance between trying to capture the wholeness of something, and then also for it to be direct and responsive.
I really feel that in a context of polarization, of rapid change, words matter more than ever. And I saw this a year ago when we presented our Declaration on Women's Rights. So, many people, myself included, were a bit kind of hesitant about this declaration, because it's just words. Usually as policymakers, we're very focused on action, and this roadmap for women's rights is a list of women's rights principles and objectives. No policy actions there. That's what we're doing in our strategy, right? And then we presented it, and I accompanied my commissioner to New York, to the Commission on the Status of Women, which is the largest global gathering on gender equality at the United Nations. And my expectation was that perhaps this declaration would be perceived as a little bit weak, maybe even a bit meaningless, in the context, which was March 2025, just after, the second Trump inauguration. It was taking place in New York, this conference. I expected that perhaps stakeholders wouldn't feel that this document from the EU really meets the urgency of the geopolitical moment. And in reality, our declaration was welcomed with open arms from delegations from around the world, because in this context, reiterating commitments and staying the course on gender equality priorities, including in our language and terminology, matters. So it shouldn't be underestimated.
In your work, Halliki, you're saying, policy building takes time, it's careful, it's multiple visits, multiple meetings, inching things forward to get to where you need to go. But in your work, when you know that 1 in 3 women in the EU, for example, have experienced physical or sexual violence, part of you must be screaming, can we just get on and fix this? There must be urgency there. And you talked about, in a way, being sometimes policy being blown off course by the next crisis and the next crisis. And yet you feel clearly that gender violence and gender inequality is a crisis. We just can't push it high enough to the top of the agenda to get everybody to treat it like a landslide or a disaster.
Absolutely. I mean, during the COVID pandemic, it was the Secretary General of the United Nations who called gender-based violence the shadow pandemic. And it's exactly that. I mean, even when you look at the numbers, it's mind-blowing. Yes, and I think that maybe this is something that I've learned in my years of working on gender-based violence specifically, and also of becoming a leader. You were asking me about that earlier. What have I learned? And I guess it's the patience, because I have no choice. It's infuriating, but the infuriation also keeps me going and keeps me chipping away. When I first started, I couldn't believe that people, colleagues had been working on gender-based violence policy for 20 years, and soon I'm getting there. And I now see that all of that chipping away, so the laws, improving those, the policies, improving the services, training practitioners, raising awareness, all of that does make a difference. But cultural change is much slower even than policy change. And we just have to stay with it, because it's not an option to give up. I've seen that sometimes staying the course and preventing regression is progress, or is an achievement. So it's not always possible to move forward, or to move forward fast, but reiterating previous commitments and not moving back is very important, and then can create space for forward steps later.
That's fascinating. So the idea that sometimes you just hold on tight and wait for that storm to pass.
Exactly. And that also takes concrete action. It doesn't just happen. So regression, the slide down can come easily. So holding the fort is a concrete action.
Sorry, I just have something else to add on that, because as you were thinking, I was thinking about the policy space and how words are being used. And what I find really interesting about this current moment, and there's a struggle over words as well. In my work, I did a lot of interviews or follow-up interviews with people who were kind of making sense of the reconfigurations around Britishness after the summer anti-migration protests, and the Operation Raise the Colours, the flag situation that was happening, and what these meanings of like the Union Jack and the St. George's flag, and how post-colonial migrants were responding to these things. And I think words do really matter, and there's always a struggle over words. So in this proliferation of words, there's also power's attempt to fix the meaning of words. And I feel like there's always this interesting dance with individuals as well, struggling back over reclaiming those words and what those words mean and how one can use them. So I think, it's an interesting time, because not only is there this inundation of information and words are having this huge impact, but there is this attempt to intervene through language in particularly powerful, crazy ways.
That's so, and as you're speaking, Seetha, I'm thinking about Halliki's background growing up in Estonia, and that incredible singing revolution, which took place between 1987 and 1991. And actually all that was people singing forbidden patriotic songs from Estonia to defy Soviet-era restrictions and call for independence. It was just words. But when you amplify it to the degree that it was over the period of time that it was, 4 or 5 years, with tens of thousands of people singing together in public, that actually led to what they wanted, which was independence, along with Latvia and Lithuania in 1991, without any conflict. Tell me what that makes you feel, Halliki, when you think about that part of your history.
It just makes me kind of realize and feel rather emotional about having been born at such an important time. So, I was born in early 89, and in just a few months before I was born, was one of the largest gatherings of the singing revolution, which reportedly was 300,000 people. And to be noted, the population of Estonia at the time was 1.5 million. So it's really a large proportion of the Estonian population who gathered together. It was also often at night to sing these songs. And I should also specify that patriotic songs for Estonia, that usually means, we're singing about our forests. Estonia's 50% forest. We're singing about the sea. Our border is 2/3 the sea, so it's not about conquering others, which I find very beautiful. And then a few months after I was born was another very significant event, which was the Baltic chain, where people formed a line from Vilnius to Tallinn holding hands. And this was again a very significant peaceful protest. My father was part of it. My mom was home with me. I think that, of course, and unfortunately, Estonia's independence, along with several other countries, is once again under threat. Well, Putin's invasion of Ukraine took place on the 24th of February, which, by the way, is Estonian Independence Day. And, my mom thinks that it's definitely not a coincidence. So I guess I just, with this background, I guess I'm just glad that I, work in an institution that brings countries together, but at the same time respects the independence and sovereignty of each of those countries. And we're doing what we can as a union to not only support our own member states, but do whatever we can to support Ukraine in this instance.
But that is an example of an entire country, an entire culture leading itself as a community. There wasn't sort of one key figure. That was neighbours and friends and communities standing together and singing that. So what fascinates me about that is the fact that, we think of leadership being down to one person's shoulders, and it really, really isn't.
Absolutely. And by the way, these singing festivals continue. So every 5 years we have the big one. The last one took place last summer. Again, it was like 100,000 people, and we always have heads of state, etc. there. So it's really become a huge part of Estonian culture and nationhood.
Seetha, has there been a moment for you where you've thought, gosh, this is leadership in a way that I haven't seen it before? This is leadership either from the grassroots, like Halliki's example, or something that has really shocked you in a way, saying, this could work. It's not traditional leadership, but it could work for the long term.
It's interesting hearing you talking about the singing revolution, because my previous work before I started my PhD, my MPhil was actually on solidarity protest movements. And I was also focused a lot on music and the role of music in solidarity protest movements. So I was looking at the Lebanese diaspora in France, and specifically initiatives that were organized around the Beirut port explosion, where people were working on coordinating sending medical supplies from France to Beirut to help rebuild and support some of the aid initiatives that were happening there. And I think when I think of leadership, and I think of collective leadership and leadership that comes out of those spaces of solidarity and are often in social movements, it is about care. It's about, feeding each other, taking care of each other, checking in with each other, even just, helping connect people with news about their families. I think oftentimes the model of leadership is very centralized or singular, and it's very difficult to move away from the model, which is like the hierarchy, top-down, structured approach. But actually in those spaces, like the singing revolution, I imagine would have been such a powerful example of that. very horizontal, very about that ethos of care on its most basic level, I think is a very inspiring approach to leadership.
Yes, and this reminds me of my favorite leader, if I had to choose one, who I had the privilege to meet last year, Jacinda Ardern, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand. You may have read her memoir as well, which is really about the importance of vulnerability and care in leadership. And I find it so inspiring because, of course, what she talks about is usually associated with women leaders specifically, with perhaps lack of oomph and strength and some other words that might be associated with leadership more traditionally. So it's countercultural almost, right, to state that insecurity, doubt, vulnerability is central to good leadership. But I cannot think of anything that's more true in terms of how we can lead well in a way that brings people together and brings us forward together.
Seetha, Halliki just chose Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand as her favourite leader. Do you have a favourite leader for the long term, and why?
Oh gosh, that's a really hard question. Oof. I don't actually know if I do. I mean, I think because my conception, I very genuinely feel that my conception of leadership is collective rather than singular. And so I struggle to think of an individual or to place my value of leadership on an individual. I think there are so many incredible movements and they're often very small. I mean, even, local food banks and spaces like that, spaces of community care, I think are more where I would place my kind of aspirations of leadership. So I think it's maybe more models of leadership than a specific leader.
And that's so interesting in a time of chaos and a time of uncertainty. It's like, well, don't worry, it's not all on one person. Yes. We're not all expecting too much from one person. We can get band together and help each other. It takes a village.
And I think as well, I think the feeling that I get the sense of from a lot of people, not just in my interviews, but it's a big sense of disillusionment in a lack of political hope in formal institutional leaders, or just feeling like when people have the constraints of formal power and leadership, that often they can't do what they said they would, or they've just living within those limitations. And so I think that's also a little bit why, that idea that it's about a collective project and focusing on those spaces, whether they're local food banks or community kitchens or grassroots organizations, that I'm just like those feel like more hopeful spaces for me at the moment.
Sorry, I just wanted to say that I think you're a true Gates Cambridge scholar, Seetha, because you just reminded me of one of the key eligibility criteria for a Gates Cambridge scholarship, which is not only that you're a future leader, but that you have humility in understanding that you cannot achieve big change by yourself. So I think that's a beautiful connection to what you were talking about in terms of collective leadership.
Thank you, Halliki. That's wonderful to pick up on that.
I was just thinking also about how Seetha, you've been talking a lot about how you listen to other people's stories, and I was also wondering about your own story and how you bring that into your research and your work, because I think that's also a really powerful part of our personal leadership and our presence in our professional and research identities. I mean, I myself, I told you about my focus for delivering on EU gender equality policy. And, all this while entering into the third trimester of pregnancy with my second child, and looking forward to his arrival and the related shifts in focus in my life. Of course, I think the topic of gender equality and having children are, intricately related, and I absolutely feel that is also something that I contribute in this leadership position, that I want to be able to show to others and experience myself that it is possible to combine leadership roles with having small children. But that's just one of the ways in which I bring my personal story into my work.
That's so interesting you say that, Halliki, because quite often, certainly even now, people are sort of trying to compartmentalize their lives and be one person at work and one person outside work. And COVID, to some degree, blew that out of the water. But in roles like yours, it probably is quite unusual, but it allows other people to show up as their full selves if you are. And that's really, really interesting. Seetha, could you say a little bit more about how you developed your identity as a leader? What were the moments where you thought, these are my values, this is my North Star, I'm going to keep showing this?
Yeah, thank you for that question from you both. It's something I'm thinking a lot about. And I mean, my identity and my life experience and my own stories and all of the reason why I'm drawn to this project, it all spills and bleeds into my work. There's a really porous boundary, I think, between what I care about very deeply as a human being and the work that I do, whether that's in my film work or whether that's in my research. And my research does blend autoethnographic reflections. So I did this project with Cambridge Encounters, the Creative Encounters, and it was to write a poetry research diary throughout my field work. And inevitably that is a very personal reflection of, my experiences in the field, my relationships that I form and friendships that I form in the field, and also just how my own identity is intervening and making me see these questions in different ways or making me relate to these questions in different ways. So that actually is a part, the creative part is in the actual thesis. So that comes up. But I think in terms of ways of relating, I don't know. When I first started doing qualitative research, I had a very fixed idea. Oh, you've got to be very careful not to contaminate the data. You can't put yourself into the space too much because you'll be taking either it'll be, narcissistic and taking up too much space, or it will be, leading people into saying what you want them to say, and you're all seeing it through your biased perspective. But what I've found is that it's just an amazing tool of connection, my own experiences. And often people will invite me into they'll want to know, they'll be like, how do you relate to this? What has been your experience? How do you relate to London? What's your family's migration history? And it ends up feeling a lot less extractive in a way, I think, because there's a sharing of stories and space and histories. And maybe the final thing I'll say is in the cooking interviews, which were really interesting. I did these cooking interviews, Halliki, with my participants. And that was so fascinating because I was almost, I'd cook with maybe a younger family member being taught by an older family member. And in that way, I was also being brought into that family dynamic. And I have inherited something from that as well. I've learned something about how to make a recipe. So there's a lot of my life now that's been shaped by what I've learned through the research experiences that, in something as simple as like how I cook dal, that's been shaped by, so I think there's a lot of blending across those two things.
What I'm hearing from both of you is the importance of openness, even when you're the leader, even when you're directing a film, a project, a piece of research, a piece of policy, this idea of porosity and being open to other ideas, giving off signals that you're there to listen as well as to lead. In fact, actually, you can't lead unless you're listening. That seems to be a way of creating a sense of solidity, in a way, a sense of endurance, rather than the sort of headless chicken, oh my gosh, here's today's crisis. You've got to project that sense of calm if you want others to follow you. Would that be right?
Yes, and if you just want to cope yourself, the pace is just insanely accelerated, especially now in this political role. And when I think back to how much time I took over, every page of my PhD thesis, how I overanalyzed every single word, and now the number of documents that I need to review, approve, etc. in a day, it's vastly different.
So how do you cope, Halliki? What are your kind of mechanisms for dealing with that sustained pressure?
Yeah, so I actually think that I think that my personal life and having small children, or one so far, actually helps, because it means that when I'm at work, first of all, I cannot work all the time, unlike other people, in such roles, who don't necessarily have as many care responsibilities. So when I am at work, I'm incredibly focused, and it's extremely intense. But then, my mindset shifts to my daughter, to my partner, etc. When I'm at home. And I actually think that it forces some balance into my life. And again, I find it important to insist that I don't pretend that I'm constantly available, etc. So I think that helps. But this kind of like projection of calm, I think, yes, at the same time, to connect with colleagues and others, sometimes you also need to be kind of have solidarity in panicking and then finding a solution together. So, because I think it's also not necessarily genuine to, and I think being genuine is very important.
So that's back to Mark Carney, the idea of partners who share enough common ground to act. It's not just sharing enough common ground, but it's sharing enough common ground to do something, to lead us somewhere better. This conversation has been fascinating, and it's always an absolute challenge to try and bring an episode into land when we're in mid flow here. But given that we are in this global spin cycle at the moment, and this age of uncertainty and anxiety and volatility, which we've talked about, what can we do today to keep our eyes on the prize and work for the long term without getting blown off course? This is our so now what? Seetha, what about you?
Maybe it's because I'm in a teaching mode that I'm thinking a lot about what we talk to our students about. What is sociology? Like, what does sociology offer the world, and why do we study sociology? And I think something I've been reflecting a lot on is, the classic idea of what does it mean to have an ethos of just constantly questioning, interrogating, reflecting on the kind of taken for granted concepts or structures that exist in the world. I feel like that is really the heart of what sociology is trying to offer as a discipline. And, what I think, and it ties back to this idea of this contrapuntal thinking. What would it mean to be thinking contrapuntally when we engage with the news, when we engage with each other, when we engage with our organizations, with the solution? So what does it mean to really sit in contradiction on all of those scales, or create a little bit of space for contradiction? I think that's where I would, settle on.
Thank you very much. What about you, Halliki? Send us away with something to do for you.
Well, I'm very much focused on what I am doing. For me personally and professionally, the now what in the coming weeks and months is very clear, because I'm on course to deliver several major EU gender equality policy initiatives, including the gender equality strategy for the next 5 years and the EU's participation in the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, and then I will deliver a baby. So I think that, the personal as political, all of that is coming together very much for me, and in the next weeks and months.
But how can you help if we're watching the EU in your absence? Are there things that we should be looking out for? Are there things that you hope will happen for the rest of 2026 while you're carefully bringing up the next generation?
I hope that we, and that means everyone looking to improve the lives of others, that they don't get sidelined by chaos, by statements that are way too liberally thrown around by various leaders around the world, and that we come back to our own personal values and our values as countries, as organizations, etc. Equality, including gender equality, is a founding value of the European Union. It's there as a basic value in our treaties. It is also a personal value for me that I implement in my personal life as well. And I think this, is a helpful North Star. So I invite everyone to stay true to their values.
Inspiring words there from my guests, Seetha Tan and Halliki Voolma. And that's it for episode 2, season 3 of So Now What. And just a reminder that this whole season of the podcast is themed around leadership. So stay with us as we continue to unpack that with the purposeful, effective, big-hearted leaders in the Gates Cambridge community over the next few months. And many thanks to my guests today, who are all of the above. EU civil servant Halliki Voolma, Cabinet Member of the EU Commissioner for Equality, Hadja Labib in Brussels, and researcher and creative Seetha Tan, who is poised to submit her PhD thesis on post-colonial migration and identity formation at the Department of Sociology at Cambridge any minute now. So huge milestones and rapid changes ahead for both of you in the coming months, and I wish you all the very best for those. My thanks too to producers Mandy Garner from Gates Cambridge and Nick Saffel from the Central Communications Office at the University of Cambridge, and thanks to all of you for listening. I'm Catherine Galloway, and this was So Now What with Gates Cambridge. Join us again next time for another episode on the leaders we need right now, brought to you by those who are already out there doing it.